Hi, my name is Trinity, and welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through church history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History. On March 9th, 1522, some people met for dinner at the home of Christoph Frauscher, a printer from Zurich, Switzerland. It was a dinner to be remembered. In fact, a dinner that made history. It was a season of Lent, a period of 40 days before Easter, when Christians who lived in Western Europe were supposed to avoid eating meat as a sign of sorrow for their sins. But what did the Frauscher serve? Sausages. Find out what happens next in this exciting episode of Kids Talk Church History. I'm Trinity. I'm 16 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
And I'm Christian. I'm 14 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
I'm Linus. I'm 13 and I live in San Diego, California.
Okay, so what happened to all those people in the story?
Well, in those days, breaking church laws was a crime, so they all went to jail.
Shouldn't they have known that they would go to jail? Or why would they eat the sausages?
I read that Frauscher was concerned that his employees, who were with him at dinner, were exhausted after finishing a long printing job and needed some good nourishment. Also, Frauscher didn't think eating sausages was a sin because the Bible doesn't tell us not to eat meat during Lent. In fact, it doesn't even talk about Lent.
But did they ever get out of jail?
I'm not entirely sure about that. But a priest named Ulrich Zwingli was present at the dinner, but didn't eat the sausages, spoke from the pulpit in the Frauscher's defense. He said that even if the Jews fasted on certain occasions, God never made it mandatory, and the church should not impose any rules that God never made. Other people were already thinking that way, so they liked Zwingli's sermon, and soon a Reformation started in Zurich.
That was only 5 years after Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church in Wittenberg. If Zwingli had given that sermon earlier, we might celebrate the Reformation by eating sausages on March 9th.
Yeah, we can still do that. I think this episode is going to air on February 12th, and so there's still time for our listeners to organize a sausage fest in Frauscher's and Zwingli's honor.
February 12th is also close to Valentine's Day, but I don't think it really coincides with this.
Yeah, actually, Zwingli married before Martin Luther did, at a time when he was still considered a Roman Catholic priest, so many people gossiped about him. But his wife, Anna Reinhardt, deserves an episode too, because she was a widow with 3 kids when she met Zwingli, and was soon left a widow again with 3 more kids, and so she had 6 altogether. But she worked a lot to support the Reformation in Zurich, and I read that one of her daughters, Regula, opened her home to refugees who came from England to escape persecution from Queen Mary.
And that's a story for another time, right?
I think that regula means rule in Latin.
Yeah, that's kind of an unusual name, but then again, mine is also unusual.
Mine doesn't sound usual either, but anyway, I've never met anyone named Rule.
I've only heard about Zwingli when our pastor explained different views of the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, Zwingli actually disagreed with Luther on the Lord's Supper. Luther didn't follow the Roman Catholic teaching that the bread and wine actually became the body and blood of Christ, but he still thought that Jesus was present with the bread and wine. We can ask our expert to explain it because it's a little complicated.
I know that Luther and Zwingli met each other and that they agreed on pretty much everything except for the Lord's Supper.
Yes, and then Zwingli died young, so then they couldn't discuss it anymore.
He died in a battle, right?
Yeah, he, as a chaplain. That's like a pastor for the troops.
We have a chaplain at our church. At the time of this recording, he's in Japan.
So do we. But we also have a lot of questions about Zwingli. We have a great expert to help us. We have Reverend Boekestein, pastor of Emmanuel Fellowship Church in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and author of a lot of books, including 2 on Zwingli. He's actually the father of one of our Kids Talk Church history hosts, Mina. Reverend Boekestein, thank you so much for taking the time to join our podcast.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to be with you. You guys all listed your ages. I don't have to mention mine, do I?
No,
Okay.
no, you don't. You're good. So you've heard our short conversation about Zwingli. Do you have anything that you would like to correct or maybe add to that?
Well, I noticed that you've picked up a lot more knowledge about Zwingli than I certainly had at your age. So I think there's a wonderful partly what you're doing is contributing to um, an increase in the knowledge of church history among young people, which is fantastic. I didn't know too much about church history as a kid. I didn't grow up in a family where it was important or in a church where history was very important. So you're doing a fantastic job. Thanks so much for your work. In fact, I when I was asked to start writing these books on Zwingli, I didn't know as much or much more than what you've just mentioned. And so he is sort of, I think, one of the forgotten persons of the Reformation. He's known in name and for a few highlights, like you've mentioned, but I think his life, for several reasons, is not nearly as well known. But I'm looking forward to discussing his life with you throughout the course of this podcast.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for your support of our podcast. We really appreciate it. We didn't say too much about Zwingli's life because you're the one who's done all the research about him. Can you give us another short summary of his life?
Yeah, so I think it might be helpful to introduce Zwingli in connection with the two other names that are often added to his when we think about the early Reformation. So Calvin and Luther are often mentioned in connection with Zwingli. But you have to distinguish Luther and Zwingli from Calvin as being earlier than him. So Calvin is a second generation reformer. He was still a kid. He was about 8 years old when Luther and Zwingli were reforming in Germany and Switzerland. And so he has the privilege of sort of being able to build on the foundation of the earlier reformers, which is one of the reasons I think that Calvin's writing is so refined and has stood the test of time much better, for example, than Zwingli's writings have. I was shocked to read that Zwingli wrote so hastily that he often never would reread what he had written before sending it to the publisher, which is just shocking for me to think about. I mean, Zwingli never did that. So his writings are very hasty. He was extremely busy. He was involved in a lot of controversy. And so we don't remember Zwingli as much for his writings. People don't read Zwingli the same way that they read Calvin, but partly because he's a first-generation reformer. So Luther and Zwingli, though, are much closer connected. They were born just 2 months apart from each other. Only about 400 miles from each other. They both spoke German. They both received a similar classical education. Zwingli in the church, came into the church from the world of academics, whereas Luther was a monk and came into the church in that way. So Zwingli served just a few years in a couple of small parishes before taking the position of pastor at the largest church in Zurich, which is the capital of the Confederacy of Switzerland, where he served the rest of his life. So he serves in a very prestigious location where he's highly influential in the church, but also in the broader culture of Switzerland. When he comes to Zurich, he begins by just teaching through the Bible at the beginning of, I think it was Matthew, and just working his way through. And that was unusual, but people began to flock to the church to hear the Bible opened up rather than passages from the church fathers or sermons that were hard for people to understand. They were in his language. And sort of like Luther, Zwingli had a pretty I think, earthy way of communicating. He didn't try to appeal to the scholar, but to make himself known to the children and to the older people, the uneducated as well as the educated. So he begins to bear fruit in Zurich, or probably right away around 1520 or so, and then only pastors there for a little over 10 years before he's killed in a confrontation between one of the Catholic states in Switzerland. So he's really only what could be considered a reformer for 15 or 14 years. And that's the other reason I think why his legacy is less well preserved and less well known, because just the shortness of his reforming life. But within that short life, a lot of action, a lot of fruit from a fairly short but well-lived life.
We also mentioned that Zwingli had a different view on the Lord's Supper than Luther. Can you tell us a little bit about what he believed and how he disagreed with Luther?
Yeah, sure. So in general, I think this is a helpful question because it introduces some of the differences between Luther and Zwingli more broadly. So Luther was, I think, fair to say, a little bit more steeped in the traditions and the customs of the Roman Catholic Church, a less, maybe a more reluctant reformer than Zwingli was, who was a little bit more ambitious and aggressive in terms of the Reformation. So Zwingli is less interested in the Roman Catholic view than Luther is. And so Zwingli is sometimes said to have held what we might call a memorialistic view of the Lord's Supper, that the Lord's Supper is merely a memorial, sort of like a reminder, almost as if you would put a Post-it note on your desk to try to remember something that you're going to do later. You see that Post-it note and you remember to do the thing. And so maybe that's an exaggeration, but that's a little bit how Zwingli viewed the Lord's Supper. He didn't view it as a means of grace, but as a testimony of his faith in Christ and a reminder of Christ's works for him. For Luther, Christ was physically present in the bread and the wine, a little bit like how heat is present in a glowing coal. And so it's obviously a complicated matter, but I think there's a few things that we can say about it. First, I think to his discredit, Zwingli believed that Jesus' physical body is of little importance to the believer. And so he, for example, latched on to John 6, verse 63, which says, "The flesh profits nothing." And he sees that to mean even the body, the flesh of Christ profits nothing. Well, I think we would disagree with that. We need the whole Christ. We need his divinity, his humanity. The Athanasian Creed speaks of the humanity of Christ as both his rational soul and human flesh. And so we need the human flesh of Christ. And so maybe Zwingli downplayed too much the importance of the actual body of Jesus Christ. We need that body to give us life in our body as well. But second, Zwingli recognized that, so this to his credit, Zwingli recognized that believers do actually commune with Christ in the meal, that there is a sort of, that there's instead of Christ being present with believers physically, he at least acknowledged that we're present with Christ in some way in the meal, in a similar way to what Colossians 3, verse 1 says about the believer. That verse says, you have been raised with Christ. And so Paul says that, speaking to people who have not literally bodily been raised with Christ, who are still in the flesh, but he says, you have actually really, truly been raised with Christ. And so you should set your affections on the things of Christ, for example. And so Zwingli says Christ is with us in the supper sort of in that way, this real but spiritual union that we have with Christ in the meal. And then I think a third thing that we should say about Zwingli is that his view of the supper near the end of his life was shifting away from the position of the Anabaptists, this memorialistic view, and I think closer toward the understanding of Luther. I think you might have mentioned a meeting that Zwingli and Luther were, I would say, invited to, but it was an invitation by a prince, and so it was more like being told to come to this meeting. So boys, work it out is basically what this prince was saying, and the prince was right, because here's you got two brilliant reformers saying basically the same thing, but sort of fighting with each other with their pen and paper. And so they're invited to this colloquy at Marburg in 1529. And basically, it's like the prince says, go to your rooms until you figure this out, and then learn to play nice together, and then you can come out. And the Marburg colloquy was a bit of a failure. I mean, it didn't produce the unity that the prince was hoping for. They did agree, however, to 14 out of 15 points of Christian theology. So they're basically seeing the Christian faith in a similar way, but the Lord's Supper was a sticking point. They couldn't agree on the Lord's Supper, and yet they agreed to this statement: the sacrament of the altar is the sacrament of the very body and blessed and very blood of Jesus Christ, and that the spiritual eating of this body and blood is especially necessary to every true Christian. So Zwingli came to believe that the Lord's Supper is vital and necessary for the believer. It's more than just a reminder. There's something real happening beneficially to his soul. So who knows what would have happened if Zwingli had lived longer and come under the influence of other theologians more. But I do think there's good movement near the end of his life toward a position that at least acknowledges that something is happening to us, that God is feeding us with Christ, his body and blood, not physically by eating it, but through faith in Christ himself.
So this kind of relates to your last point, but when they met up with each other, I know that they had the same ideas about grace and salvation. Well, Zwingli had the same ideas about that as Luther did, but he never read Luther. Is that true?
Well, it's probably not true. Certainly not by 1529. It's not true. But this perception that Zwingli wants people to have of him, that he had come to these conclusions about grace and the sufficiency of Christ on his own, apart from the help of Luther, that perception was very important for Zwingli. We have to remember that after the very beginning of the year in 1521, Martin Luther is excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. So he's literally the arch heretic of the predominant church in the German-speaking land. And so it was definitely not in Zwingli's favor to be seen as a Lutheran. And so he's perhaps a little unfairly, he distances himself from Luther. So throughout his life, as you suggest, he vehemently maintained that the Lord led him into reforms before Luther was well known in Switzerland. And so I think it's fair to say that Zwingli felt the need to exaggerate his disassociation from Luther for political reasons. So certainly he did read Luther. But how early did he read Luther? That's a question that's worth considering. Many scholars date the start of the Reformation in Switzerland to 1516. So that's a year ahead of the German Reformation. There's really nothing that Zwingli would have read or profited from by Luther prior to 1516. And so in some ways, Zwingli does come to Reformed ideas independently of Luther, at least early on. There's no evidence that he's carefully studied Luther's writings prior to 1521. But that ought not surprise us. In other words, if we believe as Protestants, as Reformers, that the Protestant Reformation really is just a recovery of biblical doctrine, then the fact that there's overlap between what Luther discovers and what Zwingli discovers at around the same time is not that surprising. Add to that the fact that around the 15 teens and 1520s, the time for Reformation was ripe in the Roman Catholic world. There had been forerunners of the Reformation making gains. People were uneasy with decisions coming out of Rome and growing increasingly so. And so what you have in Zwingli is basically he begins his career as a biblical humanist, but he transitions to becoming a biblical theologian for a lot of reasons. And they're not all owing to Luther. There are circumstances in Zurich. There's, the development in Luther, his own reading of the Bible, his reading of the church fathers who shared a lot of the same views as Luther and Zwingli, and then other contemporary literature, not just Luther, but others. And so, yes, Luther exaggerates his non-reliance on Luther. There was some drawing from Luther, but probably not very early on in Zwingli's ministry.
So, about your books on Zwingli, I know that you've written one that's for adults and one for children. Can you explain them a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. The children's book is in the Christian-focused Trailblazers series, which you may know about. It's a wonderful series with dozens and dozens of books in it. That book is suggested for elementary to middle or early high school. So roughly from 8 to 14, younger kids will have the book read to them and older kids will read it themselves. It's definitely more conversational than the bite-sized biographies book that I've written for adults. And I think that conversational tone makes it one of my favorite books that I've written. I've imagined the dialogue between Zwingli and his friends and Luther and his wife and children and so on. But the dialogue is based on substantial research. So I think it's realistic. It was definitely a fun book to write. I wrote the book in about 2015 when my oldest child, our son, was about 10 years old. And so he was right in the audience age that I was writing for. And so I had, for example, I remember I'd sometimes be downstairs at our house writing the book, and I'd come up during lunch or other breaks, and I'd want to read to my son some of what I had written to see if he liked it or see if it made sense to him. And I remember at one point I read a paragraph or a page or something, and Asher said, "Dad, I don't think that makes much sense. Could you got to make that more clear." And I said, "Well, let me explain it to you." And so I proceeded to explain what I meant by it. And he said, "Dad, you're not going to have the opportunity to explain to readers if you don't do it in writing. You have to change what you've written." And so he was exactly right. Anyway, so it was a fun process. I think I was able to put a lot more emotion into the children's book by the addition of dialogue and projecting the thoughts and feelings of the characters. But so the Christian focus book is for younger readers. The Evangelical Press book, I do think it would be accessible to teenagers who, I guess it depends on your reading level. It's longer, 38,000 words or so compared to 29,000, so not tremendously longer. But it is part of a series that is meant to be readable by ordinary people who enjoy reading. So there's definitely differences, but there's overlap between them as well, of course.
I've read about Zwingli's wife, Anna, who was a great supporter to Zwingli during the Reformation in Zurich, Switzerland. Do you talk about her in your books?
I do. I talk about her quite a bit more in the bite-sized biography book because there isn't an abundance of information on her, which is not surprising. It's really surprising that we know anything about almost anybody from history. I mean, I was just reading a biography on William Shakespeare, and one of the most popular people in England in the late 16th century. And we know very, very little about him. We know almost nothing about where he was on any single day of his life. And so I just say that it's not surprising that we don't know too much about Anna, but in the children's book, I was able to give her a bigger place because we imagine dialogue and take a little bit more liberties there in terms of the discussion. But we do know some things about her. We know that she was a member of the church that Zwingli pastored in Zurich. So she had the interesting, awkward situation of dating her pastor, but it was far more awkward for her in her day because you have to remember that Zwingli is a priest. Even after there's begun a drift from the Roman Catholic Church and priesthood, he's still a priest. And so Anna's a widow, a member of his church that he pastors, as you mentioned, had children from her previous marriage. Eventually, they start noticing each other, and they marry in 1522, but they marry secretly because, again, Zwingli's a priest. He couldn't marry. He was developing a more biblical understanding of marriage. He had been meeting with other priests, talking about the need to marry and their understanding that the Bible doesn't forbid marriage even to pastors. And so along the lines of what you mentioned earlier about the affair of the sausages. If Scripture doesn't forbid something, then it shouldn't be forbidden to one person by another. And so some of the priests get together and write a letter to their higher ups to ask for permission to marry, and that isn't granted, and it doesn't look like it's going to be granted. And so they do finally. So they marry in secret in 1522. They finally do have a more public, open reception in 1524. So they're married. They seem to have a very good life together. There's evidence that as Zwingli's working on his translation of the German Bible, he'd bring proof pages home to his wife to have her read them and offer her impressions of how understandable the German is of his translation. She would do like many good Christian wives do, keep their husbands from getting into too much trouble by being too risky or dangerous or foolish. She'd try to protect him and make sure that he was rested and well fed and take care of their guests and all the things that godly women do. So their marriage seems to be a loving one. There just isn't a tremendous amount of actual evidence about her personal life.
I was wondering, since we've been talking about Zwingli, what is your favorite story about Zwingli's life?
Well, I think one is you've mentioned the affair of the sausages. It's interesting. I mean, you wouldn't think of eating sausages as being a big deal. It wouldn't put people in jail. It wouldn't get people. It wouldn't force a minister to write a sermon and publish a booklet about it. But of course, as you mentioned, I think it was eaten during Lent, and at that time, the Roman Catholic Church forbade the eating of meat during Lent. And Zwingli, interestingly, I think, as you mentioned, he doesn't actually eat the sausages at the event. I think maybe out of sensitivity to his public position, maybe demonstrating some caution and wisdom. But he certainly steps in to defend those who had eaten the sausages, because he says they haven't broken a crime of God, and so you shouldn't say they've broken a crime according to man either. And so, interestingly, Zwingli preaches a sermon after this event, lauding the believer's liberty from the doctrines of men. And that sermon itself was illegal because the city had earlier banned controversial preaching. And so, and Zwingli had done a pretty good job of trying to respect that ban against controversial preaching. But he finally realized this is controversial, but I can't avoid it. And I think we would recognize as well that even though in our churches today we don't strive to be controversial or to constantly be exciting people or animating people against those of other positions, there are situations that we just naturally bump up against in life and in the Bible that will be controversial, and we have to speak to those things. Not just ministers, but kids at school or kids in their social lives. We don't strive to be controversial, but like Zwingli, when the time demands it, we have to be controversial. So he was, and in time, this also contributed to Reformation in the city.
Can you explain why Zwingli went to war? And also, was that a religious war that he went to?
Yes, this is a very important question, because one of the few things that people can say about Zwingli, if they don't know too much about him, is that he was a warrior and that he died in battle. And that assumption is only partly true. He did die in battle, but he was not a warrior. And he wasn't a deliberate fighter. He did participate in war on several occasions, not just the war that in which he lost his life in 1531. But he goes to battle for different reasons than people might assume. So first of all, it's interesting that Zwingli actually rose to popularity and notoriety through his early preaching against the practice that was common at his time of Swiss men selling out their military services to other leaders. So he preached against mercenary soldiering. So the Swiss were known as good warriors, and whether it was the Pope or some other leader, they would hire Swiss men to go fight for them in battles that really didn't belong to them. It wasn't to defend their homeland or to defend their honor or anything like that. And so Zwingli preaches against this. He says, look, soldiering may be necessary at times, but don't sell yourself out to be a soldier. There are other occupations that you could take up. Fighting foreign wars creates multiple social problems. It violates the spirit of Christianity and so on. So interestingly, Zwingli actually becomes well known not for his fighting, but for his fighting against fighting, for his writing against fighting. So he's not. He was not a pacifist. So he wasn't against war, but he was certainly against unnecessary fighting. And then later in his life, he writes a pamphlet to one of the Swiss states on the evils of warfare. He encouraged his parishioners to take up more constructive occupations, while, of course, allowing them to defend their families, defend their territories against foreign invaders, and so on. So he's not against war, but he says, make sure that you have a good reason to go to war. And then, of course, the complicating factor here is that he himself does go to war, but he goes in the capacity of a pastor and as a chaplain. And so essentially what you have in Switzerland at this time, certainly in Zurich and in the places that he had been previously, was there was no standing army. So it's a volunteer army, or it's an army made up of the citizens that go to war when necessary, as needed. And so Zwingli would wish that there was no war, but when his men are going off to fight, he realizes he can't stay home. He needs to go with his soldiers. He needs to encourage them. He needs to be a chaplain, to pray for them, to help them through their fears and confess their sins, perhaps as they're about to go to their death. And so he does go to war. He does die in battle, and ironically, the last battle that he goes to in which he dies, he actually does argue for. So he argues to the Zurich Council to go to war, but he does so as an alternative to the other plan of the city council, which was to continue an embargo against the other states that were more Catholic. So the city council was withholding food and other materials from these other Catholic states. And Zwingli says, this is cowardly. If we're going to, if we need to assert our rights here, let's do it not by starving ordinary citizens, but by going into full warfare. And so yes, it's interesting. I had the privilege of going to Zurich as I was researching one of these books, and you go into the city square of Zurich, and there's a picture of Zwingli holding a Bible in one hand and a long sword in the other, and it sort of gives the impression that was his life, that he was reading the Bible in one hand and fighting battles with a sword in the other hand. It really isn't accurate. It really just is a symbol, I think, perhaps of his death.
So I know you've written other books for children, so could you list them for us, and if you have a favorite?
Sure. So 4 of my children's books are part of a series on the Reformed confessions. And so Faithfulness Under Fire is the story of Guido de Bray, who wrote the Belgic Confession. So it's about his life and that confession. The Quest for Comfort is the story of the Heidelberg Catechism. The Glory of Grace is the story of the Synod and Canons of Dort. And Contending for the Faith is the story of the Westminster Assembly. I wrote that book with Dr. Joel Beakey. I also wrote a church history coloring book called A Colorful Past. So there's at least one coloring sheet on church figures from every century of the New Testament church age, from the Apostle Paul to Machen. And so that's, I think that's a helpful book in the sense that it tries to tell the story of the New Testament church age in brief, of course, but through the lives of these characters that young people can color. And you won't get too many chances in your life to color a person being burned at the stake. And so this is a rare book in that sense. And then finally, my best day of the week is a book about the Lord's Day and about the beauty of worship, even for children, trying to walk through young readers about what Sunday is for and how we honor the Lord. It's probably my favorite book of all my children's book. It took about a dozen years to get from the idea to early drafts to publisher rejections and finally acceptance to finally a finished book. And so in that sense, it has a lot of memories for me. And so we wrote it for young children, which my children were very young when I started working on the book, and then they got a little older by the time the book was published. But I think the artwork's fun. The theme is important. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of that Sunday book. I can see why it could be important, especially to younger kids who don't understand why they're going to church.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Linus. We want to know what we ought to believe, but also why. And so there's questions in the book that little children would ask, and I recognize that even in the book, there's some habits, some Saturday night habits and some Lord's Day habits that are not going to be the same in every family, but we ought to communicate to our children. Our children ought to ask good questions. Why do we do this, Mom? Why do we do this, Dad? And so that way we're informed about what we're doing rather than just going through motions.
So unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, and I wish it didn't have to because this has been very interesting. But we have two questions that we ask all of our guests. The first is, how did you become interested in church history? And if you could meet anyone from the time of the Reformation, who would it be?
Well, those are fun questions. I'll be short with them. I've always been interested in history, even from a younger age. But as I mentioned, I didn't grow up in a family or congregation where church history was studied. It was sort of something that was overlooked in the curriculum of Christian families. So, but I started, probably like Mrs. Carr, I started writing about church history because of a perceived need in my own congregation. I was pastoring in my first church and in my second church as well, a congregation that's historical. We value the insights of those who have gone before us. We teach a historical faith. And so as I taught through the Reformed confessions, I wanted our children to have pictures in their minds that offer a setting for the truths that we're teaching. And so I'm thankful that it has benefited not only the local church, but also the churches outside of that church. And also adults have said, there's a lot of things I didn't know about the history of our confessions that you were trying to teach to our children. And then the other question, who would I like to meet from the Reformation time? That's a really hard one. I'm hopeful to meet all of them one day. But since I've written more about Zwingli than the others, I would probably enjoy meeting him. I could tell Zwingli, I've been to the village you grew up in, and I've walked through your log cabin and into the bedroom that you slept in. And so just that connection of kind of seeing the mountains behind his cabin that he and his brothers would go up to watch cattle and sheep when they were younger, and later in Zurich was able to sneak into his pulpit and into the study that he worked in next to the church. So just that personal connection would make me want to meet Zwingli.
Reverend Boekestein, we are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us and also your expertise on Zwingli. We are very thankful for you. And listeners, if you visit our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, you'll find a link where you can enter a drawing for a free book. This time we are giving away Reverend Boekestein's book, or Zwingli, Shepherd Warrior, where you can find more about this great reformer. While you're on our website, check out our past episodes, special news, recommended readings, and more. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts Christian and Linus, I am Trinity. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.